Hello, and thank you for joining us again. We're starting a new thing. We call it Investigation Bible, and I'm going to be studying the Bible with you, along with anybody that will do this with us. And we'll be doing it more from the eyes of maybe law enforcement, evidence based related things. Because I am myself now retired, but I was a law enforcement officer for a couple of decades, recently retired, and now on to this next adventure. So, anyway, I hope you'll join us in studying this thing called the Bible. Last time we talked about what the Bible was, the Holy Bible. Bible just means book. The Holy Bible is the holy set aside by God. That's what holy means, set aside. And so set aside by God for his word. So we call it the Holy Bible. But the Bible itself, a Bible, is any book. If you look in a bibliographical study or anything like that, that's bibliograph. It comes from the word book, which is Bible. So anyway, we're going to study this Holy Bible throughout the next, I don't know how long we're going to do this, but as long as people want to do it, we'll keep doing it. And last time we talked about what it was, where it came from, a little bit. We just touched the surface. We're going to get more in depth on all those issues as the weeks go by. But this week, I had mentioned in the prior, I had mentioned that the Bible, while not being a history book, has got a whole lot of history in it because it's actually written from eyewitness accounts. And so therefore the history's there. It's not written as a history book except for the Kings and the Chronicles. Those were actually written as history books. But the rest of it, it's not really written as a history book. I guess you could say the Gospels and Acts are telling you what happened, but that was recent events. And so I wouldn't call those history books, but they are recording what we would call history. So what we're going to do over this episode today is we're going to investigate some of the historical claims of biblical information that has been questioned in the past. And as time went on, those questions fell away. And we actually found out that the Bible version was what was true. Okay. Now, I'm just going to touch on a few things. There's not many. But when I was going to college, that was a long time ago because I'm not young. I'm a father of 5 and a grandfather of 2. And so I've been around a while. And so when I was young and I went to college, I learned from my religion professor. It wasn't it was a secular school, secular college, but I learned from a world religion professor that David, King David, was just a fictitious character, kind of an Arthur character. Maybe he existed, maybe he didn't, but it's just made up stories about this guy to give the people of the Israeli nation hope. And he probably wasn't even written about until the time of what was called the exile. That was when the Babylonians had taken them as captives, and that was in the 500s BC. It's fairly well known historically that happened, so everybody accepts that. But before that, they weren't really accepting of it, any of the stories in the Bible. And so they said David didn't exist. They said that the first 5 books of the Bible were written not by Moses, but by a priest and a judge and a Yahwist and an Elohist and stuff like that. And it's called the documentary hypothesis. And they said it wasn't written until that 500 BC era. They said things like the name Yahweh was not used, that God had Old Testament, God had a girlfriend, a consort, if you will. And all these other things that they talked about, that the Bible you have isn't what was true. Okay, no Jericho. The story of Jericho was not true. There was no Jericho, actually, 100 and something years ago. They hadn't uncovered it. They hadn't found any other references to it, so they just assumed the Bible was wrong. There's just a ton of that stuff that I learned when I was young, okay? And even in the few years since I went to college, some of that stuff has been debunked. For example, there's inscriptions now, multiple inscriptions, at least 3, maybe more, with David being mentioned. And one of them super interesting. It talks about an opposing king who defeated a king of Israel named Omri. Omri is a few people down. After David came Solomon. After Solomon came Rehoboam. But then they split, and the northern place kingdom was, their king was Jeroboam. Well, Jeroboam, down his line, a couple of people down the line, shows this guy named Omri. He's the king. We now know a lot about him historically because other people wrote about him. And this other king writes about Omri, how he defeated him, and Omri is of the house of David. Okay, so this is written just a few years after David's alive, but they're still giving David the honor of being the head of the family, so to speak. So David was still very famous in the 900s BC. He lived in the 1000s BC mostly, but in the 900s BC, when this inscription was found, maybe late 800s, he's still famous. Okay, so now that's been found. And there's other things. In fact, they think they found his palace in Jerusalem, at least a wall. I mean, this is recent. This is very recent stuff. But David is definitely a historical figure, most assuredly. Now, the next step is to not just deny him, but to say, well, he wasn't a big deal or a big king. But once they uncovering his palace, they kind of finding out that maybe he was a kind of a big deal in his day, not just a little tribal leader or something. But anyway, nonetheless, it's just that there's a lot of that stuff. Jericho. I learned that in the 1800s, I was reading some people in the 1800s that they didn't believe Jericho existed, so they said the Bible isn't true because Jericho didn't exist. But then in the 1930s, a guy named Garston, John Garston, he's an English archaeologist, he found Jericho. It was a big mountain, it's called a tell, archaeologically. A tell is just a city that kept getting built upon, because in the old days, they built cities where there was water, and if an earthquake came or an enemy came and destroyed the city or any of that stuff happened, it would get torn down, but then they would build right there again. That's what people did. All over the world they did this. And so the last layer, they just basically demolished it and used it as a foundation for the next layer. That it was already demolished. They didn't have to do much demolishing, but I mean, once the city was demolished, they just took and flattened it out to make the next level, to make the next level, to make the next level. And as that went on, it gets higher and higher and higher and higher. And those cities are called tells. Okay, that's just the archaeological definition of that. Well, they came across this tell and they start digging in it, and lo and behold, they find out that it's actually Jericho, this city that supposedly didn't exist but was in the Bible. Okay, and there it is. And Garston, it's the 1930s, before World War II started, he was digging in that area, and he came across a whole bunch of stuff, including a section that the walls of this city fell outward. It's kind of an interesting thing. I'll get into that in a minute. The walls fell down, and there was a complete level of destruction where the entire place had been burned. Everything that was burnable was burned. And a really interesting thing, it's the only time in any ancient city this has ever been found where something was overrun by a military, group of people, overrun militarily. You got all kind of jars with all kinds of grain. Turns out that this place was destroyed at the time of harvest. And they had all the grain inside in these big receptacles that they kept the grain in to feed them, make their bread and everything for the rest of the year. It's all full. Nobody took it. That's really weird. Never been seen in any other ancient city, because you take the spoils. That's what you do. Armies conquered places and took their stuff. That's what they did. Even before the Romans, there was no standing armies. Actually, you didn't get paid to be in the army. You got paid by going with your army and defeating somebody else and taking their stuff, and you got to keep a portion of that. That's how the armies got paid in ancient times. But none of the stuff is taken. This is totally strange. However, the walls are down. You got to go up to the top of the city, and all the grain is left, which would be very valuable. So what would explain that? And oh, by the way, it's also burnt. Okay, this whole level. Well, the only thing that would explain it that I can see is that's what the Bible said happened. It said that God told them, do not take the spoils out of this city. And Joshua, this is Joshua's time, when Joshua was in charge, Joshua told the people, you're not allowed to take the spoils from the city. And they didn't. They did take the spoils from the next city, one thing, and it caused a big problem. But we're not going to talk about that now because that's a different part of the story. And it's not. I'm not studying this to learn what the Bible says, like spiritually. I'm studying this to see how it fits with historical things that we found. So anyway, they found all this evidence at this burned level, Garston did, and he dated it to about 1400 BC, which would fit within the time of the Exodus. The Exodus would have probably happened around 1450, roughly. I'm just giving round figures. And then, of course, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they come into the Holy Land, the Promised Land. Well, that would put it around 1400. That's when Garston dated it. And so he found everything the Bible said, exactly the way the Bible said it. And he said, look, it happened the same time. He wasn't a Christian, by the way. Garston wasn't a Bible believer that I am aware of. I've never heard him say he was, so I don't believe he was. But he did use the Bible in archaeology in the Middle East because it was accurate as far as he knew. And so he's reading this and he finds all these reasons to date this at this particular time. What did he find to date stuff? Well, what most archaeology does is they date stuff through pottery because pottery changes through time. And if you have pottery that dates up to a certain time and then there's no more, then that's about the time that you can date that section of your dig. Okay, so if you have pottery, we're just gonna make it up. But if you have pottery that dates to 1000 BC, you know that dig is at least 1000 BC. You know that because you got stuff in there from that time. It's definitely further back. But it's probably not closer to us because they would have more things, that would be closer to us in the ground. And they found all kind of pottery that dated to the 15th century. That's the 1400s BC, before Christ. And they found some scarabs. They found 4 different scarabs. Scarabs are these little, I don't know, brooches. I don't want to call them in our modern time, but they're just a brooch, okay? But they were in Egyptian. And then, of course, these people weren't that far away from Egypt and the people of Jericho, and they had trade and everything else. And so anyway, they found 4 different scarabs in that city dating to the time of Amenhotep and a couple other pharaohs. I'm not remembering their names offhand, but there's a female, I can't remember her name, but she was pharaoh, and she wore the beard, not because for any other reason than you couldn't make the rules unless you had the beard on. But she was in charge. She was, I think, Tutankhamun's grandmother or something. I mean, I've read this stuff, but I didn't look that up because that wasn't the point. But we found 4 different scarabs with those people's names on it, so it has to be at least that old. But it can't, it couldn't have stopped before them because then it would be crazy that you have the names of these people. An example, if you had some writing at the time of Columbus and it mentioned George Washington, you would know that wasn't true. You'd be like, no, that unless it's a prophet or something, you know that's after that, so you wouldn't date it from that time. You would date the dig from the time of at least the newest thing you found. And so they found these scarabs in the 1400s BC with names of different pharaohs. Okay, so that helps put it in there. And pottery also from this time. Now there was a later dig by a lady named Kenyon, Kathleen Kenyon, and she was very respected. She just dated it different. She dated it 100 years earlier. That's still accepted by most people. That's the first thing I learned was the fall of Jericho was in the 1500s BC, not the 1400s. But there's been quite a few people. A guy named Bryant Wood is a current archaeologist who's done a great deal of studying of both Garston's and Kenyon's, what they kept, because we still have these things. And he studied them, and his PhD is in ancient pottery. And he came to the conclusion it's definitely at the same time that it should be, about 1400 BC. So it fits, and the story fits because the walls of Jericho, we know what it looked like now because we've uncovered it. Though it had a retaining wall of stone, then brick wall. It's pretty tall and about 7 feet wide, and then another area that you got had some housing in it and stuff, but that we're not sure, that might have been military barracks and everything, because they had to fight all the time back then. And then up the hill, another wall that's about the same size as the one going around the city, and it's going around where everybody lives. Okay, very large area, and very impregnable, And the Bible says that they walked around once a day for 7 days. On the seventh day, they walked around 7 times, blew the trumpets, and the walls, according to the Hebrew, fell upon themselves. That's what the Hebrew says. If you can read it in Hebrew, it says the walls fell upon themselves. Well, and then the soldiers from Israel ran up into the city. That's what it says. That's exactly what happened. The way this city was so tall, when the walls came down, they fell outwards. And as they fell outwards, they made a ramp all the way down to the ground. And the people ran up into the city. And they were told not to take any of the grain or any of the scarabs or any of the gold or any of that stuff, and just burn it all. That's what they were told to do, and by God, and they did, and that's what they found. They still found things like the grain there. It had been burned, but it's still there right now. Okay, it's the only explanation that I can see that makes sense. So that's just a city that 150 years ago didn't exist according to history books. But now not only does it exist, they've uncovered not just that layer, the layer that is pretty unique in the history of mankind, but it fits with what the Bible describes as the time that Joshua, the walls came tumbling down. But they've uncovered that city down further and further, way back past when anybody had writing or anybody had even pottery. Pottery wasn't even around. It's Neolithic is what it's called, the Neolithic area. When Joshua came in there, it's the Bronze era, Bronze 1, Bronze 2, that kind of stuff. By the time David shows up, it's the Iron Age, okay? But right now, this is before the Iron Age, this is the Bronze Age. But it goes way back before the Bronze Age. The city of Jericho goes back to the Neolithic times, and they found all kind of evidence of people living there way back then. So not only is it a city that we used to think wasn't true in the Bible, but it is. It's one of the oldest cities the world's ever known. I mean, it's one of the first places people moved and built a wall around. And so anyway, nonetheless, that's just one example. The other example I did mention was David and Omri. It's not really his grandkid, but the line of kings of Israel. And Omri, of course, is mentioned by this other king as the house of David. All right. But now I got one of the most interesting ones. When I found out about this, I was blown away. I didn't find out about this till probably 7-8 years ago. And I don't know why, because it got uncovered in 1979. I think the dig started in 1979, and in 1980 they uncovered this necklace with 2 little scrolls on it. They found it in a tomb. Okay, so they uncovered this area, and hey, here's a tomb. And the ancient Jewish people, what they did, not just the Jews, other people did this too, but the Jews definitely did it. They would hewn out of the rock an area for their family if you were wealthy, okay? And that would be your area you would bury your family in, okay? And how they did that was they took your bones, and after you died, they pulled you apart. This is just history. They put you in a box called an ossuary, and they let you dry out for about a year. And then they took your bones out and they put them in the family tomb. All right. And that's what they did. This was something that was common. Well, they uncovered one of these tombs in the 7th century BC. 7th century BC, way, way back. Okay, before the time of the Exodus, after the Exodus, but before the time of the exile, which is that Babylonian thing I talked about. We'll do that in the future, but that's when Daniel lived and Nebuchadnezzar and all those people in the Bible. Well, nobody really doubts Nebuchadnezzar living because we got a lot of evidence for him historically. But anyway, we know when he lived. Well, this is before that. All right. This is actually the 100 years before that time that this necklace was discovered with 2 little silver rolled up things on a scroll. Now, back then, somebody wore it around their neck, and everything. And the Bible does say in the Old Testament, put God's word around your neck, put it on your doorpost, know it when you're walking out of your house, know it when you're walking into your house. We do that now. I mean, most people, I know tons of people, not even Christians. They're not even Christians, but you go in their house and they got some sort of biblical reference about their home on a wall somewhere. We do that now. Well, they did it back then too. And this thing is amazing because it has part of the law written down by Moses. It actually has Numbers 6:24 through 6:26. And you know this because if you've ever gone to a church and done a benediction, I mentioned in the first show that I wasn't raised in church, and I was not, and I wasn't a Christian until I was in my 20s. But I did go to church. I mean, some girl invited me as a teenager. I went. Heck yeah, I was not going to go. And then some of my friends all went, and I would go with them. And I went to church. I knew what it was. It wasn't like my family was against it. We just didn't do it. But they always did. In those days, it seemed like all the churches did a benediction. And so that was at the end. And during that benediction, they used to read this. And it says, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you and grant you peace." And then there was a song a few years ago, "May the Lord bless thee and keep thee, cause his face to shine upon thee." Well, it's right out of Numbers. Moses wrote that. 1,500 years before Jesus, Moses wrote that down. Okay? And it's Numbers 6:24 through 26. That's what's on this necklace. And it's about 700 years after Moses wrote that, but it's still around. And people are reading it, and they're putting this Bible verse, what we would call a Bible verse, on jewelry. And the people of Israel, and this person had it around their neck, okay, on silver scrolls. And we now have it. They're called the silver Hinnom, Hinnom scrolls. And that's because that's the area. Katif Hinnom was where it was uncovered. That's the reason. I think the guy's name was Barclay, something like that uncovered them. I don't remember that for sure, though. But anyway, that was in 1979, 1980. And by the time they deciphered it, it was a pretty big deal. Because, I mean, this is the oldest Bible verse that's been dug up in the ground. Okay. Now, I think that was written 700 years earlier. So there is older verses, but we don't have a copy of any of them, of course, because most of them are written on papyrus. And papyrus doesn't last. Once in a while you'll find an old papyrus thing that's in a really dry area, but not too much. By the time the Dead Sea Scrolls come around, even the things that were written on those, they lasted a little bit longer than the ancient stuff did. Okay, so it's hard to find things from 1500 BC. What we have is writings, copies of those original writings. That's what we have. So there is nothing like that almost anywhere in the world for anything else too. Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that's written, gosh, I didn't look it up, but 600s BC, 700s BC. I didn't look it up. If I'm a little bit off, it was written quite a few centuries before Christ. Okay, Homer's epics. We don't have anything in ancient writing of his for almost 1,000 years. Nothing. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't accurate. It's just that people copied it and copied it and copied it. And by the time we have the oldest extant version, hundreds of years have gone by. That's the way it is. So that's the same thing with this Bible stuff. The original scroll that Moses wrote this stuff down on, it's no longer around. But then they had people called scribes, and they would copy it down and copy it down and copy it down. And we still have the original version of that, I believe. And some people don't, but I actually do think we do. And I think things like these silver necklaces show you, because it's word for word, and it's God's name, Yahweh. Also known as the Tetragrammaton. It's actually 4 consonants. You can't speak it. The Jewish people, ancient Jewish people, didn't speak it. They would write it down with one pen per letter, the 4 letters of God's name, and that's it. 4 consonants and YHWH, and they would not mess that up. I mean, they were really careful about that. But this necklace has his name. Technically, it reads, "May the Tetragrammaton," I'm going to use the word Yahweh. I'm not even sure that's accurate. So if you're listening, understand, and you know that, you can understand what I'm saying that for. But I'm just going to read it and use the term Yahweh because we kind of know that in our modern language. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh cause his face to shine upon you and grant you peace. That's what those necklaces say. The Hinnom scrolls. So look them up. It's amazing. And that's 600 years, 7 centuries BC, 600 years before Christ. Okay. There's a really neat one. Very recent discovery. Very, very recent. In fact, it's in 21. It was discovered last summer. Okay. And it is a part of a jar that has the name Jerubbaal. And you say, well, what does that mean? It's written, that's his name, in a Paleo Hebrew script, ancient Hebrew script, okay? Jerubbaal. Well, if you know the story in the book of Judges about Gideon, you may not, but it's in the book of Judges. Gideon is a guy that God calls to say, hey, I'm going to get you to kick out the Midianites that are overrun your people. And he says, I'm not an important guy. Why would you use me? And he says, because you're not an important guy. And I'm going to prove that it's my hand that's doing this. And so Gideon decides to have a showdown, though, with God because he doesn't want to do this. So he says, I tell you what, I'm going to lay out a fleece, a lambskin. I'm going to lay out a fleece with all that soft, lamby, wool there. And in the morning, if it's wet and the rest of the ground is dry, I'll believe you called me to this, and I'll do it. But if it isn't, I'm not going to do it. I'm thinking I'm going crazy. Well, that happens. And then he thought about it, Gideon did, and he said, that was a pretty easy test. How about we do it the hard way? One more time, God. If you're really calling me to do this, I'm going to put out that another fleece, and then I want you to make all the ground around it wet, but the wool completely dry, which would be impossible. The other way I could see, hey, it got wet in the night, but then it dried out. The fleece held the water, so it's still wet, but everything's around is dry. I could see him saying, well, I don't know, maybe I didn't do that right. So then he makes it impossible, and that happens. So then he says, okay, you are telling me to do this. So he starts to do this, and he gets backlash. His own father, who was Jewish, Israeli, his own father, who's Israeli, has a temple to Baal, which is a false god that all the people around were worshiping, that all the prophets in the Old Testament said, stop doing it, but the people still did it, just like now. Look, how many prophets do you know, and maybe not we're called prophets, but how many preachers, how many things, how many times you open the Bible and it tells you something, but it's not what we do in our culture, so you just dismiss it. Because that's not what we do today, okay? And that's for old people or whatever. Honestly, that's what we do. They did it the same thing. They did it the same. He lived after Moses a few hundred years. He knew not to worship Baal, but Gideon's father had a shrine to Baal. Well, he goes and tears it down. And his dad's not too upset about it, but all the people in town that were worshiping Baal, they wanted to kill him. And his dad talks him out of killing him, and he says, call Gideon Jerubbaal, which just means let Baal deal with him. If Baal's real, Baal will get my son for doing it. Don't go hit him with a pitchfork, okay? Just let him alone. He's called by Yahweh, and we'll let this thing run its course, and then we'll see basically which one's really God. That's what his father said in a nutshell. And the people accepted that. And he got then the nickname Jerubbaal. And we just found last summer part of a jar. It's broken. And it has the name Jerubbaal. It's dated to the exact same right time, at least within 100 years. It's in the country of Israel. I'm not saying that it's necessarily his. Maybe they called other people Jerubbaal back then. I don't know. There's a lot of people with the name Bill. Well, my name's Bill. There's a lot of people with that name. I don't have any idea if it's the guy Gideon. But it was at least common enough to be on a jar at the exact same time that he lived. in the same place he lived? I think you're stretching credulity to say it has nothing to do with him. In fact, quite the opposite. It's clear it has something to do, at least with the story. Okay. I think that one's is the most fascinating, but because it's so new. I'm going to touch on one more. I know we're running out of time here for our show, and I'm going to touch on one more, and it's just a small little thing. They had signet rings back then, okay? And they had if you worked for the king had his own signet ring, but you would have a ring that had like the authority to write a letter and then seal it. It was all a scroll, and then seal that scroll with a piece of wax, and then take your signet ring that had your sign on it and push it into the hot wax. Then everybody knew it's not open. This, whatever letter it is sealed, and it hasn't been opened, and it's got the official signet ring. That's what they were called. Well, we found one. It's dated to the 6th century BC, 7th century BC, sorry. Same time as those necklaces, exact same time, basically. So before Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, the 100 years before them. It's dated to that time, and this guy's name is on it. It actually has his name. Okay? Why is that important? Because that guy's name is in the Bible. And it's an unusual name. We haven't found it any other place written down. And I'm going to read the verse it's in. It's 2 Kings 23:11, and it says, it's talking about Josiah. Okay, Josiah's dad was Manasseh. Manasseh was a terrible leader. He was the son of Hezekiah, who was a good leader, good king, caused people to serve the Lord. Manasseh, for some reason, rebelled against that, like a lot of people do today. How many people do you know their parents are godly people and the kids are not? Okay, well, the kid wasn't, and he becomes king for a lot of years, and he basically starts up all the bad serving of Baal and all that kind of stuff and worshiping them. He recut the groves. I'm not going to get into that. You can look that up. But he did all these. He put places to worship false gods. He dedicated a lot of things to. In fact, even to say these horses were dedicated to the sun, not S-O-N, but S-U-N. So they were doing some sun worship and all against the Bible, even though it was already there. The Old Testament, a lot of it had been written, at least the law, and it was against all that stuff. Well, when Josiah becomes king, he's the Manasseh's son and the grandson of Hezekiah. He's more like his grandpa, and he starts reforming everybody back to worshiping God. Okay. At this time, they find a copy of the law. They read it. Everybody cries. They're like, we're not doing what it says, and we need to do that. So this was in the revival of Josiah. During that time is in 2 Kings 23:11. And then this is what it says. He, meaning Josiah, removed from the entrance to the temple of the Lord the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun, S-U-N, sun worship, not allowed. They were in the court near the room of an official named Nathan-Melech. Josiah then burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. So chariots were very valuable, and he actually burned them. They were extremely valuable in those days, and he burned them. I don't know if I would have done that. Josiah's a better man than me. I'd have just put a new name on him. This is to Yahweh. I don't really want to lose my chariot here. But anyway, Josiah burned them, and that's what it says. But the name of the official was Nathan-Melech. That's the signet ring, Nathan-Melech. It's at the right time. It's found at the right place in Jerusalem. It's got this guy's name on it. It's crazy. And the only people that get that is people working for officials for the king. And it was found in an official area of the palace. It's just another thing. There's so many. And I'm just touching the surface. And next week I'm going to touch on the surface of other things. And the next week others. And then eventually we'll come back and we'll get more in depth on all this stuff. Because I'm just scratching the surface on this stuff. But this is the information that led me to Christ. This is the stuff that made me say, wow, there's really something to this other than just going with a pretty girl to church on Sunday. I mean, seriously, because that's the only reason I ever attended church when I was young. And I found out there was a lot more to it and was shocked in doing so. And that's what I want to share with you over this, our time together during this podcast. So thanks you for joining us. I'm Bill Kaufman. Our show hopefully will be on for a while, but it is Investigation Bible, and we're just going to keep looking into it for the next quite a few, I don't know, shows. Maybe quite a few. So thank you for joining me, and you have a good day. We'll see you soon.